Thank you very much. Again, Jennifer Nipanak, Anin Bojo, Animikiajik, Dijanika, Sapchin Nimananda Mamaga Bijayek Nungam, Makwadudem, Minoge Zebi Dunji. I just wanted, again, to ensure that I introduce myself in my own language, advising where I come from. I'm from the Treaty 4 Territory in Pine Creek First Nation, and I am currently the Associate Vice President here on Indigenous engagement here at the university. Just started on August 1st, so I'm sort of getting to meet people here, and I know I've had a chance to meet a few of you here today. But so anyways, I'm here, not about me, I'm here to introduce our speaker today. So a little bit about David. So David Robertson is a nationally best-selling author of children's books, graphic novels, and novels. His books include When We Were Alone, winner of the McNally Robinson Best Book for Young People Award at the Manitoba Book Awards and the Governor General's Literacy Award. Will I See, winner of the Manuela Book Design and Illustration Award, graphic novel category, and the YA novel Strangers, which won Michael Van Roy Award for genre fiction and won David the Award for Best Indigenous Writer at High Plains Book Awards. For those of us who've been reading this place, 150 Years Retold, a part of the One Book Winnipeg project, David will be familiar as the writer of the story Peggy, which tells the story of Francis Gamagawa. I didn't do it. I tried so hard. I practiced a little bit before. Gamagawa. Peggy Magatha. Okay. Who was decorated First World War veteran, Peggy, otherwise known as Peggy, World War veteran, and is in his later life a significant Indigenous rights activist. David educates as well as entertains through his writings about Indigenous peoples, reflecting their cultures, histories, communities, as well as illuminating many contemporary issues. David is a member of the Norway House Cree Nation, and he lives here in Winnipeg. So please join me in welcoming David Robertson.
Oh. Pop. Good afternoon. It's nice to be here. This is I was walking up. I always get a kind of a nice feeling walking up to the campus here because I used to go here. I graduated here 20 years ago now, which really dates me. Actually, I was thinking like I was here in 1999. I guess I'm older than I feel or act, but. I'm here to talk about comics, but I want to frame it around perception, representation, and how storytelling through the medium has either negatively or can positively impact how we see each other and how we see ourselves. And I want to do that. For a little while anyway, talking a little bit about how, framing it around a personal story of just my own life and the role that comics played in my life, both in a good way and in a not so good way, and the way in which that experience, really paved a pathway for where I would go in my writing career and the concentration that I would have in writing the graphic novels that I've written, and I do have a very particular focus in the work that I do. One of them is to ensure that I'm telling stories of truth, and we would call those own voices stories. So stories about people who are from a marginalized group, written by somebody from that marginalized group, and those stories of truth are important because we didn't have them. Especially when I was growing up, I didn't have them. And then along that same vein is to talk about the items in history and cultures and languages and peoples that were told by others when I was growing up, and also to ensure that I was representing those people accurately and appropriately, and so I wanted to kind of tell the story of how I got there, and I want to leave some time at the end for questions as well. So hopefully there are some questions out there about my work or just comics in general. I'm sure a lot of you out there may be a little more sophisticated in their comic knowledge than I am. I just read them. And then I don't really, when I was a kid, I didn't really dissect like what I was reading. But in hindsight, I can think more about what they meant to me. But all that being said, I wanted to talk just a little bit about my youth because, and why I want to talk about that is when I was growing up, the ways in which I learned about my identity were contingent on what I had around me. And so usually you learn about yourself in a number of different ways. And one of those ways is through your family connections. That's one of the most important ways you learn about yourself. When I was 2 or 3 years old, my parents separated. And so my dad was born and raised in Norway House Cree Nation, which is a northern community, about 8 hours, depending on who's driving, 8 hours. 8 hours or so north of here. I can get there in 6.5 probably, but you shouldn't probably try to do that. But I only say that because I was there one night and the plane didn't land, which happens sometimes. And so I was in the West Island cottages and I was thinking, I need to get home. And then this guy knocked on my door and said, you want to get home? We can go home. We can go right now. And it was like 7 at night. And I thought, well, okay, let's do it. And so we got home at like 3, at like 1 or 2, which was actually pretty good timing. That's another story. Anyway, but he's from Norway House, so that's where my indigeneity comes from. Like I'm part Cree. My mom was born and raised in Manuela, Manitoba, which is a town in southwest Manitoba, and so with my parents being separated, my dad wasn't around. My mom had custody of me and my brothers, and so that part of my connection to my identity was gone. And when you're in a one-parent household, and you don't have your dad around, when you see your dad, you don't sit him down and ask very important life lessons. You don't ask tell me about my life and your life, Dad. You just want to see your dad. Like you just want to go golfing with him or go to a movie with him, and so we didn't have those talks, and so I didn't have that. So I had to rely on other sources about learning about what it meant to be me, and so it was experiential, and it was also exposure, and so one of the earliest memories I have about to me the beginnings of a sense of what it meant to be Indigenous was in Manuela, Manitoba. And Manuela, Manitoba is it's in the Banana Belt, so it's a hotter area of the province. And I was the only. So my brothers and I used to take turns going up to Manuela. We used to go there 2 weeks at a time, and we got time with Grandma and Grandpa. And so there's not a lot to do in a small town like Manuela. So and I love Manuela. I'm being honest. There's 3 things you can do. So you can go to the playground. The playground is treacherous. Though I don't know if there's anybody been to Manuela before, but the play apparatuses are all metal, or at least were, and rusted and sharp. So if you go there, you're going to get iodine after. Grandpa's making little stick men, look like the Pearl Jam stick men actually, in hindsight, and all over my body after the playground visits. We would go golfing a lot at a great golf course there in Manuela, and we would go to the pool. And the pool was great, in a place that's usually over 30 degrees in the summer every day. You want to dunk yourself in the cool water, but it was also a place where you're totally exposed. Like I didn't wear Speedos, but I was there, and I was the darkest kid by far. Like Manuela is not a very diverse community, and so I was the only brown-skinned kid for miles. I mean, the closest community might have been like Chanapawakpa or something. That's a Dakota community, maybe a couple hours, an hour and a half from Manuela. So I was the only brown kid. I was picked on a lot when I went to the pool. And I didn't really understand why at first. Like I didn't know I was Indigenous till junior high. So, but when I went to the pool, there was a group of kids that started to bully me, and there was a ringleader there's always the ringleader, and he had this, fiery red hair, not like this. I'll talk about this later. And he was huge. I was a small, gangly kid back then. And he was like Shrek to me. He was just he was so scary. And he used to chase me around the pool. You thought I was going to talk about comics today. And he used to chase me around the pool, and he called me Burnt Toast all the time. So he called me Burnt Toast over and over again. And that was because of the color of my skin. And so I remember feeling like, if I look this way, people are going to start treating me this way. And so it started to develop a really negative sense of self. And it's a way, in that feeling, as I got older, I started to make connections to my indigeneity. And from that and all the things I was learning, and I'll get to the learning part after through books and comics. But I remember that summer when all this bullying was happening, I was driving with my Auntie Joan. She worked for the municipality, and she would check road signs to see if people, country kids, like, let's pull them out of the ground and play baseball with them or something. I don't know. But I say that with affection because I love the country, and I feel like I'm a country kid at heart. But so she checked the road signs to see if they were missing, because they went missing a lot, apparently. I don't know what they did with them. So we were driving, and I was like 8 at the time. I was very young. And I asked my Auntie Joan, I was reminded of this by my cousin Shane recently, that I turned to her and I said, am I ugly? Like, am I ugly? She said, what are you talking about? You're super good looking. You're going to grow up to be a 42-year-old, like, handsome guy. She didn't say that. But she said, like, what are you talking about? She said, well, these kids, they call me names and they chase me around because I have brown skin. Like, am I ugly because I have brown skin? And that's how that started to develop for me. And so these things continued. And by the time I was in junior high, I went to River Heights Junior High, I remember I got to the point where I knew I was Indigenous, and I didn't want any part of it. I didn't want any part of being Indigenous because of how people either were treating me or how people were treating others or the jokes that they were making, the comments. There was a whole lot of negativity going around. And so I have a very clear memory of the first time I actually denied self. Like, I was in grade 8. And I was a very shy kid when I was in grade 8. So this had developed over the years. Because I didn't think anybody would like me. Like, so I didn't talk to kids because I didn't think they'd like me because I was Native, and I didn't talk to people because I didn't want them to know I was Native. Like, I wanted to hide all the time, and so I was at my locker one day, and I would like stick my head in the locker like an ostrich, and I would like wait till people weren't around me, then I'd go, right? So I was at my locker, and this girl, felt a tap on my shoulder, and this girl. I turned around, this girl was there from my class, and that made me more nervous. Girls made me more nervous. And so I turned around and I said, hey, and she, not that nice, not that even that smooth. That's not even smooth, not even that smooth. I was probably like freaking out already. And she goes, can I ask you a question, Dave? And I said, sure. And I was thinking, like, what the hell is happening? What's my life right now? Like, and she goes, are you an Indian? And I said, no. And she goes, where'd you get that great tan from? As though there's only 2 options, right? And it was the middle of winter. So, but I still said I got it from like some tanning booth. Like, I had to make something up, right? So, because she's like, where'd you get that tan from? I don't know what was around that time, but something like Fabutan, I don't know, like, and so, so after that moment, I remember trying to dissect why I had said that, like what, and I started to think about. Now I can think about it more clearly, and a lot of it was, as I said, like experiential. That wasn't the first time I had experienced something that had started to manifest this negative self-worth in my life. Like by that time, I wanted no part of being Indigenous, and part of it was because I was mad at my dad. I was mad at my dad for not being around. And everything I learned about Indigenous people from these jokes, from these comments, were all negative. And what was worse was the influence that popular culture had on me. And that's where a lot of our learning comes from. It's the influence of all of these different mediums within popular culture. So, in television and in movies, and I do a whole talk on this usually. Now I'm going to concentrate on comics. We're here for comics, but one of the things I was watching recently again was Back to the Future 3, and I know you guys have probably all seen Back to the Future 3. And when Marty McFly finds the DeLorean and fixes it up, he's in a drive-in movie theater, I think, and painted on the wall at the back of this large area, there's a bunch of natives painted on the wall, and they're all the savage Indians, like they're on their like the horses and their bow and arrows, and then he gets his DeLorean going to 88 miles per hour. I think it's 88 miles per hour, and he goes back into the Old West to save Doc because Doc's dead, and well, he would have been dead anyway because it was like over a century ago. But he died like very soon after going back in time. It's hard, time travel, okay? And so he transports back to the Old West, and then he gets into this big open field, and there's actually like real live Indians there, right? And so he gets out of the car and he sees them charging at him, and he just screams out like Indians, and he gets in his car and he peels away, and they're chasing after him, they're shooting arrows at him, and that was the experience of my youth. And that was really the only representation that I had of learning about me, and this is like how we see ourselves reflected. And if we're seeing ourselves reflected in one way and we are an impressionable child, we start developing perceptions about what it means to be me from the stuff that we're seeing, right? And so, because we're not seeing anything else. So I must be that, right? I must be that. And comics were a huge culprit in that, as much as movies and TV and all Halloween and all these things were. Comics were a big culprit. And I want to give you one example. And I just went and got this recently. I'm going to be careful with it because I did pay $20 for it. But so I grew up reading comics, and that's something that is typical of boys. I mean, boys read more comics than girls typically, and because we're more reluctant readers, we struggle more with reading when we're younger, and so comics are great because this is a whole other talk, but like the sequential art form is great for people like that because the images help us draw meaning out and story out more effectively. And so anyway, so that's neither here nor there. I love comics, and I always have superhero shirts. I'm pretty sure I put one on this morning. There it is. So I love superheroes. I love comics. I've always read them. I always loved them. And one of my favorites was Firestorm. And so recently, within the last maybe 6 months or so, I went out to I think it was a Galaxy maybe, and I went and picked up the first Firestorm issue, Fury of Firestorm, the Nuclear Man, #1, collector's item. And it came out in 1982. So I would have read this in the 80s. And so the bad guy in this comic is a guy called Black Bison. And I'll show you a quick little picture of him. If I had my PowerPoint working, I'd show you the actual big picture. So I'm sorry if you don't have binoculars. But Black Bison is the antagonist in this story. And Black Bison is indicative of Indigenous representation in comics back then. So you see he has this bison head and a cowl, and I think he has a staff and everything. And so he's the antagonist in this. And I'll tell you the story of how he comes to be. So Black Bison is a guy named John Ravenhair. And at the beginning of the story, there's a couple things happening. John Ravenhair is doing a tour around a museum. And the museum exhibition is of cultural artifacts from his culture, John Ravenhair's culture, and he thinks this is great. Like he thinks he's really excited about this, right? And he's living with his great grandfather, who's an elder, and his great grandfather is furious about this. Like he can't believe that John Ravenhair putting on this exhibit in this museum, right? And so they have this this argument at the beginning of the comic, and so I'll just say, I'm going to read you a quick little thing here. And so John Ravenhair, they're arguing about the exhibit and everything, and John Ravenhair goes, "This exhibit is a chance for the world to learn about our heritage, to understand." And the great-grandfather goes, "You want understanding. I want vengeance." The elders are like that. We know that. And so John Ravenhair goes, "Like it or not, we're living in their world now, grandfather. We can't deny reality, try to hide from change by worshiping the old ways. We have to adapt. How? By falling in love with their women? Leave Vanessa out of this, grandfather. Silence! You will say no more. You will have respect. You must..." So they have this big argument. And he's this bloodthirsty elder, bent on vengeance, hell-bent on vengeance. And John Ravenhair is this reasonable, assimilated Indigenous guy, right? And so the next day comes, and John Ravenhair is touring kids through, these school buses pull up, and he's touring kids through this exhibit of his culture. And literally artifacts from his culture behind glass exhibit displays in a museum. And as he's doing this, his grandfather conducts this ceremony in the middle of a park in the city, which is where sacred spots are. That's where ceremonies happen. And so he looks like a devil worshiper here, by the way. And so he does this incantation about what's happening at this museum. And as he's doing this, these thugs come and murder him in the middle of his very shamanistic incantation, and he dies. And his spirit possesses John Ravenhair. And so John Ravenhair, this sounds ridiculous, I know. And so John Ravenhair breaks into these displays, and he dons the bison head and the cowl and the staff, and he becomes imbued with these superpowers. And he becomes bent on vengeance against the white man. And so he becomes the supervillain Black Bison. And so in this story, in this representation right here, what we have is a typical representation of Indigenous people in comics in the 80s and the 90s, sometimes today. And obviously, Black Bison isn't the only one. So I made a little list here. There's a couple of traits that are, now if you've done papers on this, you would know a lot of this, but maybe I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but I did a quick little scan of Indigenous heroes in comics, or villains. I want to run down some of these names. Apache Chief, Chief Crazy Horse, Eagle Free, Hawk, son of Tomahawk, Powwow Smith, Raven Red, Raven, Redbird, Red Warrior, Red Wolf, Shaman, Sitting Bull Zai, Super Chief, Thunderbird, Tomorrow Hawk, Wise Owl, White Buffalo Woman. And so there's a similarity with all these names and all these representations. So the names is problematic. The names are problematic. Then, if you have an Indigenous hero back then, you have to have an animal in there. You have to have chief in there, or shaman, or powwow, or a color, or something. So they have that. And they also have, so the names are they share characteristics. The names all share characteristics. They have a similar background. So typically they're going to be from reserve or around reserve. They're going to all have Indian powers, right? So they're going to have some sort of spiritually connected power. They're going to have like tracking abilities. They're going to have something. Black Bison can reanimate stuffed animals, right? So they're going to have something like that. And they're going to be typically like a secondary or periphery character. So the real important characters are going to go around, do hero stuff and be front and center, and they're going to be kind of like pushed to the background, or they're going to be someone like Black Bison and just be the bad guy, right? And so I'm reading all of this, and I noticed a couple of things strike me about this. And so what I see with it is that first of all, there's an underrepresentation. So of real characters, but Indigenous characters at all, right? So underrepresentation, and in that underrepresentation, to make it worse, so we don't even have a lot of characters that are there to see ourselves potentially reflected in. But the characters that are there are misrepresented. So we have underrepresentation coupled with misrepresentation, and that's a recipe for disaster. Sorry, right? So, if you have a kid like me, who's growing up in the 80s, who is relying on these, not without even realizing it, but relying on these outlets, these comics, to learn about what it means to be him, what it means to be me, to develop a perception of myself. You're going to have kids who feel like I did about who they are. And that's just the reality of it. And so they have great power, and they have great responsibility. You see what I did there? But when you miswield that power, I don't know if that's a word, but when you miswield that power, you do profound damage. And so we have a responsibility to do the work, and that I take that very seriously in the work that I do. To ensure that the people I'm reaching with my work have access to truth, because this certainly isn't it. And I remember, so I was in grade 9, and I'm doing pretty good. Wait, okay, I'm doing pretty good. Okay, so I want to go for another 10 minutes and take questions. So and I'll talk to you quickly about Peggy in a second, but I want to cap off this life story. So. And I'm 42. I'm only going till I'm 12 or 14. So don't worry. Well, how old are you in grade 9? 14? I'm only going to 14. So, grade 9. This is the state I was in grade 9, and it was a lot of it was because of the stuff I was reading, and the influence it had on me, and the stuff I was experiencing. And by the time I was in grade 9, I was a pretty broken kid, and for some reason, which is neither here nor there at this point, I still don't know, I was invited to a party. Now, this didn't happen to me. Just like girls come up to me was weird. And so I was at this party, and I had no idea why I was there. I didn't want to go. My mom made me go. Thank you, Mom. And when you live in River Heights, who lives in River Heights here? So when I was living in River Heights, when I left River Heights, I had no idea how the F to get back to River Heights. Like, I did not want to leave my bubble. My bubble was my safety place. This is my safe place. And so if I leave, if I cross Cambridge, or if I cross Taylor or Kenniston, I am totally screwed. Okay, so I was at this party, was outside of River Heights. My mom dropped me off, and I was stuck there because I had to wait for her to come to get me. I was super uncomfortable in this party, and I was sitting on the couch eating chips, and I still do that, but back then it was sad. And maybe it still is sad, so I'm sitting on the couch. I'm trying to hide in plain sight, and the night wears on. I'm waiting for midnight to get there. I wouldn't turn into a pumpkin. I was just waiting for my mom. And so this native kid walks into the party, and I was instantly struck with terror of this kid. I was sure that he was going to come beat the shit out of me, and I had no reason to think that. But I was positive of it because of all the stuff that had influenced me, because of all the things I had learned, because of stuff like this, and so I actually hid. Imagine that, in the middle of a grade 9 party when you're supposed to be cool and hanging out with the kids, and I went and hid from this kid at this party, this Indigenous kid, and I went to the stairwell. And there was this partition that separated the stairwell from the main party. So I was just against this partition, just trying to hide on the stairwell, and then this girl who was putting on this party walked by, and she's like, "What are you doing up there?" And for some reason I told her that I was hiding from this guy. She's like, "What?" And she's like, "Hang on a sec." And I was like, "Don't fucking do it. Please don't do it. Please don't do it." I was like sitting there, just like, please don't get him. Please don't get him. Please don't get him. And then a minute later he comes, and she has Vincent there. I remember his name was Vincent, and he's at the bottom of the stairs, and it was like a horror movie. And he starts walking up the stairs in slow motion, right? I thought, oh, here it comes. Where am I going to take it? I'll take it here. Punch me here. So, and he sits down beside me, and he goes, why are you scared of me? And I didn't know how to answer that. I said, I don't know. And he goes, well, you're going to hide here all night? And I said, I don't know. And what he did was he brought me down from the stairs, not to beat the crap out of me, but to introduce me to people there and make me feel at home there, and welcomed. And I didn't know how to reconcile that at the time. I didn't know how to reconcile what I expected from him and what I got from him. And on the way home, I really thought about it. And I thought about what happened. Where am I at because of this? Where am I at now? Why did I get here? How did I get here? And for some reason, I put a lot of it back on my dad. And so that weekend, I told my mom that I wanted to visit with Dad. And so that weekend, my dad comes over. He came over every other weekend, and I was sitting in the couch in the basement, and he walked down and sat on the couch with me, and he said, "Your mom said you wanted to talk to me." And I started bawling, and I yelled at him, and I said, "You haven't been a good dad to me." And I don't know if that was fair or not, but I've never asked him about what that meant to him, but he told me about his life. We've had this conversation now for 30 years, and what it is to me is storytelling. What he's been telling me, what we've been telling each other are stories of truth. And the more I learn about his life and stuff I had never known before, the more I learned about myself. And the more I learned about myself, the more confident I became in who I was. And so I'd been writing for, since I was in grade 3. And at one point I decided that I needed to write stories of truth too. And because I attributed a lot of those negative feelings about myself and other Indigenous people to the stuff I was learning in things like this. I'm not want to pick on comics entirely, but they've been really bad culprits historically. I decided that I wanted to concentrate my work on comics, because if they got me into this mess, I wanted them to use them to get me out and to get others out. And so I started to write comics about Indigenous peoples and own voice stories and stories of truth, stories of history, of culture, of community, that brought up issues like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that brought up residential school history, that brought up intergenerational trauma, but above all else, that brought up and represented people that others can see themselves either reflected in or see truthful representations of. And I believe that if we have more stories like that it will help shape a different perception. And it will help start to create a different reality, so that in 20, 30 years, we'll be having different conversations. And I think that's the direction that we need to go. And comics are, I believe, going to be one of the main things that help to get us there. And we see the work being done now. We see the work being done now more than ever before. In the last 10 years, I would say, we've seen this explosion of Indigenous graphic novels written by Indigenous creators, and with the same intent, to look at representation, to look at its relationship to reconciliation, and to try to usher in a new sort of time where these are relics, not our cultures, because we don't want these characters anymore that perpetuate stereotypes that existed for decades. We don't want the noble savage anymore. That's not us. We don't want the dead Indian. That's not us. We don't want the savage Indian. That's not us. We want control of how we are perceived, because we know our stories and we know our backgrounds. We know our values and our beliefs and our traditions. And I'm so excited about the work that's being done. And I'm really honored to just be one voice of many that are doing that work. And a good example of that is this anthology, 150 Years Retold, this plays. And how it went about was, and I'll just talk for a couple more minutes, how this came about was we are sitting together with Catherine Gerbacy, who is the publisher at Highwater Press, and Katharina Vermette. And Katharina Vermette has a great graphic novel series called A Girl Called Echo. And so we were sitting there and we were talking about Canada 150 and how bullshit we thought it was. Sorry. Oh, I forget you're adults. So I do a lot of talk to kids, and I always am like, don't do it. And we were like, what? We had a lot of problems with Canada 150, obviously, and we thought, what can we do in opposition to this celebration? Like, what work can we do to tell our story in what's happening now in this broad celebration of this history erasure? So we came up with this concept of looking at the last 150 years and retelling it through the perspective of the forgotten history, which is the Indigenous history. And so out of that conversation came this amazing anthology of literature. And I have one story in here. There's a lot of amazing stories in here by a lot of Indigenous comic creators and illustrators. And one of them is Peggy. And so we can have heroes also that aren't superheroes, Frances Peggy Magatha is a hero to me. And so the work also isn't only going to be done with having superheroes. That's great that we have that. I'm actually working on a graphic novel series about an Indigenous superhero named The Reckoner. But we also need to have real stories of real people, and they are heroes too. And so the story of Frances Peggy Magatha is a story of a hero. And what it does is, in presenting an accurate representation of his life, it helps to shape different perceptions. And that's as important a work as a character who has superpowers, right? And so this is one of the most important graphic novels around right now, and not just because I'm in it, because I literally think that every Canadian should read it because of the work that I think that it will do in truth telling. And so that's kind of most of what I wanted to talk about. And I guess finally, what I hope that we can do moving forward is to amplify voices. Amplify voices of Indigenous creators by supporting their work, or if you are an Indigenous creator, to put your work out there and to tell your stories, because we need more and more and more of them. And the more we tell our stories, the more others will too, right? Like I just did an article on CBC about mental health, and I think it's the same principle. I told my story about mental health and anxiety, and then I had like 300 or 400 people messaging me about their stories about mental health and anxiety, right? And so I think this works the same way. I really do. And I was at just to wrap up, I was at Peguis First Nation last school year, and I was doing a presentation on some of my graphic novels to an assembly of kids, of these amazing Anishinaabe children. And it's okay that they weren't Cree. But so after my presentation, I love Anishinaabe people. I'm just being silly. Just Crees are better. I'm only saying that because I'm Cree and I'm making fun. Anyway, so I was at this assembly with all these kids from elementary school into junior high, and And after the assembly, after I was done presenting to these kids, they kind of filed out of the gym. Admittedly, some of them didn't want to be there. I can be boring. And but then one kid came up to me, and he went up. He's like up here, and he looked up to me, and he goes, "I want to make comics too," and that's how we're going to make a difference, right? That kid's going to make a difference, right? Because if he makes comics, then I've done my job, I think. So that's all really I had in terms of a presentation. I wanted to leave time for questions, and so we have, about 10, 15 minutes for questions, and I'd love to hear from you. And even if you have a comment, I mean, my dad, I didn't talk a lot about reconciliation. I think it's ingrained in representation and truth, but my dad says reconciliation isn't just me talking to you the whole time. Right? So it's at one point that burden needs to be like shared, right? And so to me, what reconciliation is that we talk with each other, which means that you have to talk too. I'm not putting pressure on you, but that's how it works, right? Like to me, the burden of truth is on our shoulders right now, which is fine. But the vision, I think, is to have stories like this. Oh my God, what happened there? I ruined my dramatic moment. Stories like this, and what it looks like is this. This is on my shoulder right now, and what I think it looks like is that if you take this gift, these stories, and then you have it on your shoulder, and you can share it too. Does that make sense? I think that's perfect timing. Look at my Thundercats. I told you I was a nerd. But I think that that's what this process is. I think that's what it looks like. The more stories we have, the more stories there are to share, and that burden becomes one. It doesn't become a burden. It becomes a community of truth. And I think that's where we want to go. So thank you very much for listening. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah.
Would you ever consider rewriting one of those Indigenous superheroes from Marvel, like into your own?
I would love to create an Indigenous superhero for Marvel. I don't know if I would recreate one. I think that we need more of those mainstream heroes that are written accurately and by people from that community. I think that's important. Jeff Lemire had Equinox, was actually a pretty good character, but I think she was abandoned. It's like I don't think she's around very much anymore. And also, as much as I respect and really, I think Jeff has his heart in the right place. We need more like creators from those communities to make those heroes, right? And so, I would love to. That's why I'm writing The Reckoner, is because I want to write what would be like hopefully more of a mainstream superhero who is this is a Cree, just because I'm Cree, I'm not gloating about him, but he's this guy who suffers from anxiety. That's his perceived weakness, but he also has powers that aren't stereotypically Indigenous. He actually has stereotypical superhero powers, kind of flipping it on his head a little bit, I want to do more of that work. Because we do need more heroes. We're still underrepresented in that genre, in the superhero genre, and so I think we need to have more stories like The Reckoner out there in the world for anybody to read. I think it does important work, as much as these stories of history are important too. I don't think Marvel's going to call me though, but you never know.
It'd be wise to.
Thank you. Yeah.
I was going to ask, in the same tone of the Own Voices movement, what do you think the significance is of non-Indigenous artists collaborating? Is it like a form of allyship, or should a lot of these products be passed on to Indigenous artists as well?
Well, I think we need to engage with more Indigenous artists. I think there's not enough being engaged with to do the work. I've been, now that being said, like I've done work with Natasha Donovan, who's Métis. She's amazing. I've done work with Julie Flatt in picture book area, who's Métis. She's amazing. But I've also worked with a lot of non-Indigenous illustrators, and I think what I've seen is it does important work. Just like we have to learn as much as you do. Like if I have to learn these stories before I write them, and so do the illustrators. So for Scott's a good example. Scott makes fun of me, I think, when I'm not around. But so Scott Henderson, he's done a lot of work. Like where he is now to where he was when I started his career. I'm just kidding. You can tell him I said that, but I'm just kidding. But when I started working with him, 2008 or 9, he knows so much more about the Indigenous communities and peoples and cultures than he ever would have, because we have formed a partnership. And when Sugar Falls was published, he was gifted an eagle feather by an elder at the book launch, and it meant a lot to him. And he earned it. Like he's done incredible work with me, and on his own with others too, like Catherine Vermette, and so I think there is something to be said about creating that allyship through comic creation. But I also would like to see more Indigenous artists being engaged to do the work too, because I don't think there's enough of them. And they're out there too, right? So, any other questions or, yeah?
I was just wondering if you had much access to other primary documents while you were writing that, and if you found anything that you read somewhat surprising.
So Portage and Main is great because they'll give me a lot of academic research. I wrote that like couple years ago now, I think. So I think I forgot a lot of what I used. I used Voices of Sounding Thunder, and another book of his on him by a non-Indigenous writer. I think McGinnis is a relative. And I also used other academic articles and research for writing that story. What surprised me I think not what surprised me, but what impacted me most about that story and stories of a lot of our Indigenous veterans is that you have this guy, Peggy Magatha, who's the most decorated Indigenous soldier in history, and who is one of the most effective snipers in world history, and who was responsible for the lives of other men on the battlefield. You entrusted him with the lives of other men in war. And then when he got home, you wouldn't give him a horse. And I am fighting back tears right now, but that affects me. Like to think that we would have someone who would have those skills and leadership qualities that you would entrust other men's lives into. But then you wouldn't give them a loan to get horses. And I think that's reprehensible. It makes me mad. But that's a part of the history we need to know. So, part of the difficulties in writing a story that is only 25 pages long is there's a lot in there you can't write about. And so what I hope that people do with this story and others is that they take the time to learn more. Like I hope that people, when they read about Peggy, through this book, they read more about him, because there's a lot more about him to know, and he was a really incredible human being. So, but that was what probably impacted me most, and that's not an atypical example. Like it happened a lot with Indigenous veterans. Tommy Prince is one of them too. You know, he's a war hero, and he comes home and he lives in poverty because it wasn't supported. So I mean, it's gross of the government to do that. Oh, thanks.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the life that book has taken on and the impact that it's had.
I never expected that book to do what it did. I always feel a little sheepish accepting accolades for it or recognition for it because I don't think it's my story. I wrote that, for my grandma and for, thousands of other kids. But to me, it's been an important piece of healing in this country. It's also, I think, inspired other stories to be written. And I've seen a lot of amazing things happen from it, from both non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, even in my own family. And so I'll tell you a quick little story. The first person who ever read the book was my daughter, Lauren, who I wrote about in my article just yesterday. And so we read it together. And so my dad, this is another story, my dad never taught me Cree. I never taught my kids Cree. That's how intergenerational trauma works, but healing works similarly through generations. And when I read the book with her, and has the language in it, she wanted to talk to my dad. And so I think we called him up, and he got on the phone, and I said, Dad, Lauren wants to talk to you. Get her on the phone. She goes, Grandpa! And he goes, yes, my girl. And she goes, will you teach me how to speak Cree? And I think that is a powerful example of the kind of work that book has done. It's been a book of healing, and I think that I'm really proud of that book. I don't know. I'm okay if I never write anything better than it. But I think it's done a lot of good work in this country, and I'm proud of Julie for the work she did in it as well. She's incredible. And I'm doing another book with her that's coming out next 2 summers from now, which is a secret. But it's been great to work with her again. She's an incredible talent. And that book I still read from that book probably 300 or 400 times a year to schools across Canada, which then you have thousands, tens of thousands of kids growing up knowing a history they wouldn't have known otherwise. And I think that's really important. Because I didn't know about residential schools till I was in university, and my grandma went, and that can never happen. That can't happen again, So, okay. I have time for a couple more questions if you have any, but yeah.
Sort of related to the book you were just talking about. The last time you were on campus, you said that you promised your daughter a dog if you won an award.
Did I say that?
So did you get the dog?
Yeah, good memory. Okay, I'll tell you a quick story before we wrap up. Then, so at that point I was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award, and I was in Calgary at the time actually, and I was at the WordFest in Calgary, and apropos I was presenting to an assembly full of kids about when we were alone, and when I finished the presentation, I saw I missed a call from Ottawa, and I thought, oh, holy crap, this can't be. And so, and they didn't leave a message, so I should I call back? And I texted my wife, should I call back? I got a call from Ottawa. She's like, you don't call back, no. So then I was in the car on the way home to the hotel, and then they called the Ottawa number, and I was like, oh my God. So I answered the phone, and they told me that I won. And there's the driver beside me. They said, you can't tell anybody. And I was like, well, how am I supposed to hide this right now? Because I didn't want the driver to know. So I was hiding. I was like, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. So we get to the hotel, and I call my wife, and I tell my wife, and we're like, we're celebrating over the phone. Because I never thought I'd ever win that award. And then we stopped, and then we were like, we have to get Lauren a puppy now. So we did get her a puppy. So I called the breeder right after getting off the phone with Jill, and we got the last puppy in this litter. And he was a runt of the litter, but he's a beautiful Labradoodle. And she, for her anxiety, Sweetie's been incredible for my daughter, and we've had him now for over 2 years. So we did get her the dog. Yeah, he's great. And he ate one of my books actually. So. Dogs can eat your homework. But anyway, thank you very much for having me here. I really am honored to be asked, and thanks to Canada and her team, and for this whole initiative. I think it's really important, and it's been incredible to see. I've kept tabs on just like the whole. I think my dad just kicked it off with the prayer, it's been. I'm honored to be a part of it. So thank you very much for welcoming here and being such an amazing audience.